So welcome to our second session of Journalism Under Siege, Truth and Trust in a Time of Turmoil. It's great to see all of you here tonight. I'm Dawn Garcia. I'm the co-host of this course and the director of the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships. This series is a collaboration with the Stanford Continuing Studies Program and the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships here at Stanford. Each of our 5 nights is devoted to an important issue in journalism, an important issue that we focus on at the John S. Knight Fellowships at Stanford. Tonight's class is titled Power to the People, Holding the Powerful Accountable. One of the most important functions of a free press is to help hold people accountable, the powerful accountable to the people, whether that be companies, corporations, governments, platforms, or large institutions. Tonight we have top-notch journalists who are going to talk to you and have a conversation about globally and in our nation's capital how holding the powerful accountable happens in a real way. In the first hour, I'm going to be moderating a conversation with my colleagues here, Marina Walker, 2019 JSK Fellow and Deputy Director of the International Consortium on Investigative Journalism in Washington, D.C., and Cécile Prieur, who is a 2019 Fellow and a Deputy Editor of Le Monde in Paris. And both Prieur and Walker have worked on sweeping investigations, including the Panama Papers, which exposed the financial dealings of offshore business entities and won the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting. Just a few points of business here for tonight. We will have a break, a 5-minute break or so after the first session, and at about 5 to 8. In the second hour, Michael Bolden, who's our JSK Managing Director for Communications and co-host of this course, will moderate a second session. And that will be a conversation with Sally Busby, Executive Editor of the Associated Press, and Daniel Dale, White House Correspondent for the Toronto Star. They're going to talk about how news organizations and journalists help the public hold institutions such as government agencies accountable to the citizenry. Just like last week, we'll have a chance for you to ask a few questions. We have index cards that are available for your questions. Erica Bartholomew on our staff, raise your hand, Erica, will be available to pick up your cards. If you have a question, you could raise your hand and she'll get a card to you, and you can pass the card back to the aisle toward Erica. We'll try to reserve about 10 minutes at the end of each session to answer a few questions. The full syllabus for this course is on Canvas, and I hope a number of you are going there. We're putting new resources there every week. We've got biographical information for the speakers, books, articles, reports, and one of the new things we put up last week was a great 4-minute video about the Panama Papers that explains what's going on. And our guests in this first session tonight, Marina Walker and Cécile Prieur, will tell the story behind the Panama Papers. It was one of the biggest leaks and the largest collaboration investigative journalism projects in history. It was a leak of 11.5 million financial and legal records. And it exposed not just some bad apples, but a whole system that enabled crime, corruption, and wrongdoing. And it was by hidden offshore companies. The story at its core is of the super rich and elite working the system to avoid paying their taxes, something that most of us can't avoid. This project included journalists from more than 107 organizations in 80 countries. That's a lot of journalists who analyzed the terabytes of data. After more than a year of analysis, the first news stories were published in April 2016. And this project not only is a massive journalism investigation, but it also represented a really important milestone in the use of data journalism tools and unprecedented collaboration by usually competitive journalists around the world. There have been a major number of impacts of this. We'll talk about that tonight. And including a few world leaders were forced to resign. There have been audits, investigations, prosecutions, and a change in how these rules around secret tax havens are set up and allowed to exist or not. And in fact, the story has gotten so much attention. Meryl Streep is reportedly going to be playing the lead in a movie based on the Panama Papers, which we hear is tentatively called The Laundromat. So just briefly, a little more on our two speakers, and then let's have a great conversation. Marina Walker is a member of the JSK Fellowships class of 2019. I said she's the Deputy Director of the International Consortium on Investigative Journalists. She managed the two largest collaborations of reporters in journalism history, the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. Both investigations involved hundreds of journalists using technology to unravel stories of public interest from giant amounts of leaked financial data. And corralling the data and the journalists, I think, was a big job. Cécile Prieur is a member of the JSK Fellowships class of 2019, and she's the deputy editor at Le Monde, one of the leading daily newspapers in France, where she's in charge of digital transformation and in charge of investigations in collaboration with the International Consortium on Online Journalism. Very pleased to have both of them here with us tonight. So let's get going. How did this evolve from a leak from one German news organization to become one of the largest collaborative journalism projects in history?
Thank you so much first, Dawn and Michael, for inviting us and having us here tonight. And thank you, all of you, for your interest in journalism. We really need you, especially these days. So how this whole thing started? Well, there were two very intrepid German reporters who were doing their work. These things don't happen out of thin air. You know, reporters are beat reporters. They do their stories and they stay with their stories. And these reporters had been reporting the offshore financial story for a long time in collaboration with ICIJ. And there were people, and I'm going to explain why I say people, sources. We don't know. These sources are anonymous. The source decided to call himself John Doe, but we don't know if it is a man or a woman or many people. So, but we'll call it John Doe, which is what he or she decided. John Doe noticed these reporters that were staying on this important story, a story that he realized was not just about offshore accounts, it was about inequality. Because this secret world of tax havens is at the root of the big inequality crisis that we are experiencing. Why is that? Because it allows the most powerful people and companies in our society to play by a different set of rules and to basically accumulate enormous amounts of untaxed and unaccountable wealth. This source had access, we don't know how, to an enormous amount of data that came from one of the suspect law firms. Those of us who had been reporting on this, we knew of Mossack Fonseca, and Mossack Fonseca had surfaced in relationship to the Assad regime and other autocratic regimes around the world.
And that was a law firm.
Panamanian law firm.
Panamanian law firm.
And they specialize in selling secrecy. Secrecy is the product that tax havens advertise and are proud of to offer. Extreme secrecy. So what does that mean? That if somebody reveals in the British Virgin Islands or in the Cayman Islands the owners or the directors of a company, that person can go to jail for as long as 20 years. That's what tax havens sell, that secrecy. So this source made this information available, contacted these journalists after contacting other newspapers in the US, and apparently didn't get a response, and decided to go to Germany. The reporters, thankfully, were very eager to talk to the source. They asked the reasons, why are you doing this? And the source said, because I want these crimes exposed. And so they received the data, and shortly after reviewing it, or starting to review what they could, because imagine it was more than 11 million records of financial statements, loan agreements, emails. It was all the working documents of these lawyers and accountants in this Panamanian law firm for a period of 40 years, interacting with with world leaders, like the the Prime Minister of Iceland, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, some of the world's biggest corporations and banks. And all of that information was delivered to them, and at that point, they realized they could not, this was a story that transcended them, that they could not hoard this information, which is what we naturally do, investigative reporters. That's our DNA, not sharing. We all have been lone wolves.
Right.
But they decided that this was a historic event and that they needed to treat it in that way. And that was the next step, which was contacting the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. We are a network of hundreds of reporters around the world who we are on a task to defeat the lone wolf, and we believe that stories are better and more powerful when we share resources, when we share reporting, and when we protect one another in the process of sharing. So that was the model that was chosen for this story that pointed to 200 countries around the world.
So Cecilia, you were a top editor in one of those newsrooms. So this is the organization that's connecting all the newsrooms, and you were at Le Monde. What did you do when you found out? You had some information early, in fact, to share.
Yeah, so we at Le Monde, good night, good evening to everybody, sorry. We used to work with the ICAJ for a couple of years before Panama Papers.
Okay.
We were involved in the very beginning of their international collaboration, and we were very proud to be in the roots of the story. Oh, sorry, I will speak. Oh, my microphone was on.
It was underneath her
Yeah,
jacket. Yeah.
So I just told you that we were already involved in the collaboration with ICAJ before Gerard Wild, the director of
Gerald Rye.
Wild, contacted us after a leak, what we share with ICAJ, which was the previous leak before Panama Papers, which was Swiss leaks.
So there was a previous leak, and you all shared that with the ICFJ, another leak.
We had a data set from a whistleblower from HSBC. It's difficult for me to spell it in English, which is a Swiss bank, which is involved in a lot of fraud tax on tax evasion account, and we had this data set, and we had the same feeling that our colleagues of Süddeutsche Zeitung had a couple of years after, that we cannot handle with this international data. And it was interesting because in our newsroom we were used to work in investigation side with well-known investigator, very independent and lone wolves.
Very independent journalists who work on their own.
We figure out that we cannot work like that as a last traditional way of investigate.
Right.
And so we have to settle a totally new team to do that. So we trying to do that for Swiss Leak, but it was not so efficient. And after, when Marina and Gerald contacted us for the Panama Papers, we had the experience that we couldn't doing the business as usual, and that for the Panama Papers we had, because it was so enormous and it was so important for democratic issues and for our now working as journalists, that we have to try to set a total new way of investigate, and that's what we decided to do.
Right.
We built a team with very young data reporters, very talented one, and with some more experienced people involved in financial issues, and we mixed that team, and it was the first time in my newspaper that we create a total mixed team between digital and print side.
So a digital,
and that's why
digital and
it
journalism.
has worked.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that struck me when I very first heard about the Panama Papers is how in the world did you get 300 journalists to not break an embargo? Because, as you said, many journalists have been lone wolves. Obviously, this is a different way of working. But I just loved you to talk about how you organized and what kind of motivations did the reporters have to not break the embargo?
First of all, why we decided to work with so many journalists, why we're so crazy to do something like this. And it was because when we looked at the data, we realized, as I said before, that it was such a global story. And how can a reporter in Canada, as much as Daniel will love how much you guys know, or in Argentina, or in Norway, would know the story of Morocco, the story of Namibia, the story of Chile. So we needed to contact or try to recruit for this effort as many journalists as possible. I always say corruption is always first local. And in this data, it was always first local. You needed to know the name of the proxies, the name of the lawyers, the name of the best friend of Vladimir Putin who was in the data. Because Vladimir Putin is not going to be in the data or in any bank statement, right? But his best friend is going to be there and is going to be, in this case, sending amounts of $300 million at a time in fake loans. We also heard the term fake loans last week, if you remember, in the story that the New York Times wrote about the way that Trump created his wealth from his dad.
Right.
So, going back to the question, that was the motivation to create this large team was to do justice to the story. We tried to create a very diverse team, so not just big media organizations. We do have Le Monde and the BBC and The Guardian, but we also included a lot of small digital outlets in crucial places like Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and Philippines. We needed the gutsy reporters, the real deal investigators in all of those countries. For the reporters, I think the incentive was that they felt that they were part of something that transcended their egos, transcended the politics of their newsrooms that are so toxic sometimes, transcended the politics of their countries and the censorship that many of them experienced. It gave them the chance to play at a complete different level. It gave them the chance, in some ways, and I say this humbly, to reinvent their profession. At a time of so much pessimism and persecution and false news, they had the chance to turn it on its head and say, we are going to do this story, we are going to do this story together, we are going to share everything radically, that means footage, documents, editing if it was needed, although we try to keep those things a little separate because each partner preserves their own editorial independence, and that is very important. But everything that could be shared, knowledge, the most important thing one human being can share, was shared in this collaboration. And that lifted up those that didn't have resources in smaller newsrooms. It made the big newsrooms a little bit more humble. And also the big newsrooms, sometimes they actually don't have access in places in remote areas of the world or in many countries, these days, because foreign bureaus have closed. So it was a win-win for everyone. And there was a little bit of a historic sense of mission. We are here doing something that we all thought, if we, excuse me for the word, but if we screw it up, it's going to be not only a big embarrassment, we're going to be sending a message that these collaborations really don't work for journalists, and much less at this global level. We are going to be putting a source in danger, and we are going to be missing the opportunity to tell these crucial urgent stories of public interest. So all of that, I would remind them, all of those things often as a project leader, and very often. And I think that that's what kept people silent for 376 reporters for more than a year. I told them, don't talk to your spouse, to your partner about this. Don't talk to your parents about this. get a life, talk about something else.
Get a life.
Not about who you found in the Paradise Papers or the Panama Papers.
So for you in your newsroom, what were some of the exciting or different and different ways of working, but also what were some of the exciting moments out of this project? And I would also say, how many times has there been a woman leading a project like this in Le Monde?
I think there is a lot of exciting moments in this incredible project, and I totally agree with Marina about the proud and we had the feeling that we were involved in a big story and that we were making, in a way, a little bit history of journalism, but it was much more on the way we investigate, because it was very new for us. And we haven't predict the super important impact that we had in global, obviously, but even in France. So we were much more trying to face, to handle with these big issues and trying to be at the level of the collaboration, because what you have to figure out is that ICAJ has built a tool, a software where every reporters share, report, investigate.
Oh, so I was going to ask about how actually physically,
share,
software.
And share what they discovered. And my team has to be on the level of that. So we were very focused on how we can investigate in the good way the data, because the data doesn't speak alone.
The data doesn't speak alone.
No,
yeah.
You have to ask the data something. So you have to put a name in the data set, maybe Vladimir Putin, or the former president of France, or the big owners of company, a French company, or our shareholders, for example, because we obviously we put every name of our company and we put our names in the data set to be sure that we have no issue about that. So you put all the people that you could know, and the French deputies, and that's and we did that in a very series, very. It was not I have ideas, so I put that. So we just. Sorry. We think about a lot about that, trying to be very tactical in a way, logical in our research. And what maybe the big milestones, well, in the very beginning, when you discover the huge issue that we have to handle, and we used to meet very regularly, and my reporters explained to us that we discovered, and I remember that for a couple of meetings we were just wow, and it was just wow.
A lot of wows.
And we have to keep all that secret, because as Marina said, we couldn't speak about that in our newsroom, so we were in the very secret room, and we set up a totally myth about that, and we hadn't the same name of the operation, because ICAJ named the operation, but we decided to put another name, and so we didn't share anything.
Like a code name, right?
Oh,
like
a code name for the project.
Yeah, so the project.
What was the code name?
Our code name?
Yeah, go ahead.
It was Apollo.
Apollo. Okay.
Our code name was Prometheus.
Prometheus. Okay.
So we decided just to choose another mythological name, and ICAJ said put a big secrecy rules, and we follow that, of course, and we had our own rules of secrecy in our newsroom, but nobody knows about that.
Yeah.
And what was difficult is that when you are very close to the launch, it's maybe 1 month ago or 2 months before the launch, we have to
close to the launch when it's
almost going to release. You have to speak a lot of people, the photo reporters, the graphic designers,
so more and more people are involved.
More and more people are on the loop, and that is the critical point, that because these people have to figure out that it's so important that they don't have to speak outside
Yeah.
of the newsroom.
Great. Who were some of the names of people that came up that were surprising in the Panama Papers?
So the Panama Papers, I think, not to revolve too much around a story that everyone is obsessed with, which is Russia, but I have to say it was the first time for all the talk that we talk about the kleptocracy in Russia, to be able to see how it works, to be able to see the mechanism of how how money is stripped from public companies, from state companies, and how money is then shuffled around the world, bank account through bank account, in the form of these loans that are like 1% loan, like 1% interest, 30-year loan, and to be able to follow the trajectory, to see how it comes through the US, how it goes through Europe, how it goes through Cyprus, and how it goes back to Russia, to the pockets of that very inner circle of President Putin. It was quite incredible. We counted $2 billion, so we had these incredible spreadsheets and databases where some of our colleagues work day and night, counting basically dollar by dollar. And when the story broke, Putin, he did two things. The first thing was to say, this is a CIA conspiracy. The second thing he said was, the story is accurate. The money is accurate. We were like,
Wow.
But what these reporters missed is that, so his best friend that was at the center of the scheme is a cellist, a musician. And he said what they missed is that all that money, the $2 billion, we intended to use it to purchase musical instruments for the St. Petersburg Orchestra.
Oh,
so
okay, well then it's all fine.
Yeah. So besides him, Prime Minister Cameron of the UK was in the Panama Papers, and it was very embarrassing because, in fact, it was his dad's fund in the Bahamas that was in the papers. And Cameron denied until 4 days after publication that he had anything to do with this fund. And it was kind of spiraling down until like 4 days after publication, he came out and said, in fact, I knew everything, this is real, I knew it existed, and I also profited from it because I sold my shares. He didn't make a ton of money. But I think it was, we saw in world leaders like that, also in Argentina, where President Macri was a new president at the time, and it was quite damaging to him to appear there. Some of them may have been doing worse things than others, but those that maybe weren't doing that terrible things, perhaps just wanted secrecy or tax avoidance, which they don't consider is a big deal, because they denied and because they had that arrogance of, I don't have to explain this to anybody, they ended up getting themselves in more and more trouble. That happened also to the Prime Minister of Iceland, who also had not disclosed investments he had through the British Virgin Islands in the failed banks from the 2008 crisis in Iceland that almost took the country down.
I want to interrupt you for a second about the Prime Minister of Iceland, because if any of you watch, we put a 4-minute video up about the Panama Papers. There's a great scene where the Prime Minister is being interviewed. I don't know, a reporter.
That was a nice example of collaboration.
Yes.
So in Iceland, so what do you do in Iceland that is population? And I don't know actually the population, but it's something like 200,000 people. And the reporter finds that the Prime Minister is big time in this information, in this data, and that he's not going to be able to publish the story. He has to hold the story for more than a year to give time to everybody else to find their Prime Minister and their big stories, right? So what do you do as a reporter? And so what he did was, he did something quite heroic, which is he quit the public broadcaster where he used to work, because he said, if I continue working there and I have to share this with my editors, there is no way that this story is going to hold. even if not because they're going to force me to publish, but because it's just too small of a country and the relationships are just too tight.
Wow.
So he quit his job. Everybody thought he was going crazy. He covered the windows of his house with paper because he felt like he was going to be working there for a year and he didn't want people to look inside.
Wow.
Natural light is very important in a country like Iceland where it's like night for like 6 months. And he stayed there and he worked in isolation without a salary until like 2 months before publication. The interview with the Prime Minister was a cooperation with the Swedish television.
That was the reporter.
Because if this investigative reporter requested an interview with the Prime Minister was going to immediately know that something was up. So the Swedish team requested the interview. The Icelandic guy was there as well. And the interview is it's an amazing. If you can watch it, please do.
So the interview is amazing from what you see in the clip, which is he is there being interviewed. He doesn't really have any answer to the question about what do you know about this company. I don't remember which the company. Wintris. And then in the clip goes on to another image. But you told me what happened after.
He ended up escaping, leaving the interview and hiding in the kitchen of the presidential palace until the crews left. He had to resign about 3 or 4 days. At the time that Cameron was admitting that he knew about these investments, the Prime Minister resigned. Right. And others resigned later, like the Prime Minister of Pakistan, who had a lot of real estate in London that he was owning through anonymous companies.
Wow. So in France, what was the reaction, and why did people care that the stories had the French connections with that?
In the very beginning of the operation, they were a big focus on what we will reveal in the following days, because what you have to figure out is that we have all international embargoes, so we can't put all our stories in the same time because it will be nonsense.
Yeah.
So Marina set up embargoes with all the newsrooms. So she did a great job about totally editor-in-chief.
So it's like staggered embargoes, or how did you do that?
Yeah, so we didn't want to burn all the stories on day one. So we were like, let's tackle one world leader at a time and give them their time and one company at a time. So that was also hard because in some parts of the world, it was more important than in others. According to where you were, is what story you wanted to go first, second, or third. But we were able to reach some broad agreements, and it worked out.
Great.
And so because it was an operation who lasts 5 days, so it was a super long operation for an investigation.
Yeah.
We launched that Sunday in the evening in France, and we finished in the Friday in the morning. And so we told people that we had a following revelation to do. And so it makes a super big attention on our operation, because in the very beginning it was Putin, it was Michel Platini, French football, sports, it was
Messi.
people like that, Messi, Lionel Messi, and so it was the very beginning of the operation. And 2 days after, we launched our own revelation about France. And we just said that it was involving a party, a political party in France. There is a big, huge attempt. And so it was a National Front, which is a very far-right extremist party, which had an account on the offshore account because they wanted to hide about 300,000 euros, and she's totally avoiding tax and totally illegal. And so it puts some light contradiction between their current way of dealing with political affairs and the fact that they are just some criminals in a way. So that was a huge story for us, and plus the French revelation involved 2 banks, well-known bank in France, which is called Société Générale, which is mostly did the same thing that HSBC, which is created some offshore account for their main clients.
So a bank, offshore accounts for their big clients. Mm.
Yeah, and that was mostly the big stories. There is a ton of little stories, but the big stories for Panama Papers. But for the Paradise Papers, we found.
Let's say there's a Panama Papers you've talked about, and then there's the Paradise Papers.
Yeah,
just say a little bit about what the difference, or what those two.
So they were subsequent. So after Panama Papers, we thought we had seen it all, and we should just move on from the offshore story. And here comes the Paradise Papers. And the Paradise Papers, whereas the Panama Papers was more like the more rogue side of the offshore economy, with a lot of the money laundering, the autocrats, the dictators, the drug money. The Paradise Papers goes to the heart of our economy. It's the mainstream economy. Mm. And that mainstream economy, with all the big banks and the multinational companies like Nike and Apple and the Queen of England and Bono, all of those characters were also part of this secret world. They also had bought that secrecy to hide affairs, to hide money, to avoid taxes. So it was an important project to show, no, this is not just a story of rogue elements. This is the economy that we have given ourselves, and again, the reason why we're experiencing so much inequality.
So it's not something, it's not something on a rogue element, it is the economy.
And it was also like, for Panama Papers, we got a lot of support and very little pushback, except from the people who were actually, involved in the crimes. But in general, everybody was outraged. With Paradise Papers, because it touched so much of the mainstream economy, we got a lot more pushback. Law firms and mainstream law firms that had supported us and were outraged about the Panama Papers suddenly were like, well, maybe you're going a little bit too far.
So you were saying about the Panama Papers and Le Monde.
During the Paradise Papers, we have exactly the same feeling that Marina just described, that it was much more difficult to push that story, even if they are big cases in the story, because it was involving the way of the tax haven fueled the economy, and the way that rich people use very little gap in the laws to use that in a legal way. It's not very legal, but it's not illegal either. In the very, if you put, if you think about that in a very lawyer way. So they used to hire the big lawyers just to find some hole in the law to put their money. And so that's why it's much more difficult for us to debate about that, because in France we have this feeling that the politicians were much more involved for the Panama Papers. They were much more eager to denounce the tax haven, but for Paradise Papers they are much more reserved, because they know that the financial world doesn't want to be more regulate about that.
Right.
So, and that's why it was very interesting, and we had the feeling that we touched the limit of the exercise, and but we did a lot of editorials to denounce that, and we did a lot of interviews, but we have been much more challenged by Paradise Papers rather than Panama Papers.
I think that is an important point. Sometimes there might be the misconception that investigative journalists should only focus on illegal activities and crimes. Mm-hmm. And actually the legal corruption, what I call legal corruption, is often so much more important and requires a lot more courage.
Kind of gray
because
areas.
It's the gray areas of our society, like tax. So areas that might be legal because that's what a few powerful people have decided and have put laws around it, just like slavery was legal for how long. And that doesn't mean that they are not completely immoral systems. And for us investigative journalists, it's really important to get the courage to go and to expose those very moral systems that might be legal, but that doesn't mean that they're not oppressing people and they're not creating a lot of injustice.
So what were some of the biggest impacts of the Panama and Paradise Papers, and why should people care?
Okay. Well, in the United States, according to recent estimates, the 1%, the wealthiest 1% of the population owns at this point more wealth than the 90%, the bottom 90% combined. We are probably at, people call it a new gilded era. We are at the worst of inequality. And so we should care because of that. We should care because governments or these accountancy acrobatics are robbing governments from very, very much needed tax money. And I'm preaching to the choir, I hope here, but taxes are something that we do to pay for police and for school and for roads and for public spaces and for programs that make kids with less privilege have better opportunities at succeeding in life. And it's so corrosive to see how these tax avoidance and tax evasion schemes, they cut across political parties. We're not talking about conservatives here, we're talking about conservatives and liberals. And in the Paradise Papers, it was really eye-opening to see, and we shouldn't be surprised about it, but that a lot of the people that had the biggest fortunes in these tax havens were actually Democratic donors. There was one particular donor who had a foundation in Bermuda that if he would bring the money to the US in the billions of dollars, I forgot how many billions, I think it was like 12 billion, it would constitute one of the top 3 largest foundations in the US.
Wow.
That foundation in Bermuda had never given a grant, didn't have a website, didn't have any accountability. Wow. And so that's when I talk about going to the heart of the system and how in some ways, the responsibility is really distributed. And that's why these stories are so hard. It's hard to make people care. That's why the story in the New York Times from last week didn't make it everywhere. It was a precise story, a complicated, a complex story, a really important story. But the big challenge is how we connect these stories with people's personal experience. How do we make them make that click? And I think in the Panama Papers we were able to do that with a lot of effort, and that's why we saw people. But that was one of the most, rewarding moments of that big effort, to see people going out to public squares in Malta, in Reykjavik, in Buenos Aires, in London, going out in the public square like in the old times and putting pressure on their leaders and saying, we enough.
Right. I had one last question for both of you, and then we'll go to your questions. So both of you are women leaders in journalism organizations, and women are still a minority in leadership in journalism and in government. We've seen a little bit of that in the last few weeks. What impact do you think, if any, did it have being women leaders in what you've called radical collaboration, a process where you're doing things very differently than has been done before? It's not the lone wolf, it's not the sort of old model. What impact did it have, do you think, being women leaders in your organizations?
I don't know if it is the woman card which talk for leading kind of investigation, but definitely I think this kind of work needs to be settled with trust. Trust between people, transparency. Radical transparency.
Radical transparency.
In the secret team, that you have to be totally transparent. And equality in a way. So that's the way I tried to work with my team. That means that we have a challenge about equality between digital reporter. We were very young and not well known in my newsroom, and print expert. We were much more older, and the basis on that work, that's what I put on the table is that every people is equal in that team. But because I don't think I have said like that, but it was so much obvious that the way we are obliged to work, that it's totally a cooperation between them and an exchange of skills between the juniors and the seniors, and there were no top people in this team. I don't know if it is a woman way of putting things, but it was my way.
It was your way.
And so I can't go.
You did it your way.
Yeah, I did it my way, exactly.
Marina, one.
My way was, I had been in enough collaborations that were really painful in the past, that were led by others. So I took note. I had learned a lot of painful lessons. And I tried to focus not only on the outcome, which of course we all wanted that amazing outcome, but on the process. In this, it was really important to guarantee a really diverse and supportive environment for journalists that were working across languages, across time zones, across journalistic experiences, and to create that equality. Like, no, there's not going to be the BBC and the little guy. Everybody in this is equal. Everybody has the same voice, has the same responsibilities. And so because we wanted this model to work, so we can continue it and others there collaborate, we put a lot of effort in selecting who's going to be part of these collaborations, because I don't believe that everybody's made to be a collaborator, and I think it's fair to acknowledge that. So we put a lot of effort. In the past, we had, learning from all mistakes, we had focused a lot on like who's the best reporter, the best track record that has brought down more governments. And now we look at the track record, of course, and the accomplishments, but we also look at the emotional intelligence and the team playing abilities of the reporters. We look at the full person. And if we do more of that across industries, perhaps we're going to have better and more impactful results.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to go to your questions now. Okay, the first question, which is a good one. Were there news organizations who did not participate in the collaborations that you wish had? Were they the same ones who passed on the story?
I can imagine who asked that.
And this is just between us.
There were organizations who declined to be part of the Panama Papers and previous and subsequent collaborations, and it's public information, and that's why I can discuss it. Like the New York Times was one organization that we always had difficulties trying to collaborate with, so we collaborated with the newspaper chain McClatchy for the Panama Papers. And when the Panama Papers published, the New York Times readers actually held the New York Times accountable for that and started asking, why are we not reading this story in the New York Times? And the New York Times acted really well. The public editor wrote an op-ed and talked to us, and we said, who doesn't want to work with the New York Times? I want to. So the doors are open if they want to collaborate with colleagues from around the world. And they came, and there was a delegation of New York Times editors, so it's a nice feeling in our little scrappy newsroom. And we collaborated with them on the Paradise Papers. I believe you have shared some of the stories that the New York Times did on the Paradise Papers, including Wilbur Ross, our Secretary of Commerce, who was doing business with Putin's son-in-law. Right, again, Mr.
Right, good. Were any of Trump's interests or buildings involved?
I have to. So each of these leaks is a window into the secret world. And we haven't seen the full secret world. We have seen parts of it. And there's a part of the secret world that we have seen even less, and it's the tax havens that are embedded within the United States. And I'm talking not just about Delaware, but I'm talking about Nevada, I'm talking about Wyoming. There are pockets of tax havens. It's easier these days to create an anonymous companies in the name of Mickey Mouse, and that experiment has been done by a documentary crew. They created a company, and they put Mickey Mouse as the director and shareholder, and nobody blinked, right? What's the big deal of creating such company? Well, then you go and you can put a bank account. That company can become, can have a bank account. That's the problem. And then you just put the money there, launder the money, whatever you want to do. And the question was, and I went through.
Trump.
Were there any of Trump's interests or buildings?
So in the
involved?
Paradise Papers, we haven't found his personal money in any of these leaks. We did find a lot of associates of Trump's, some of his biggest donors, members of his cabinet, personal friends. And there were very interesting stories. Gary Cohn, remember the former Trump economic advisor, said something very telling when we asked for comment, or when the stories came out. He said, "Oh well, this is really not important because guess what? This is how the world works."
Wow. So follow up here: was George Soros or any of his investment vehicles?
Yes,
found in the papers.
And we reported about that, and this goes to the heart of what I said, that this is not liberal or conservative. Everybody's doing it. It's the economy, and Mr. Soros had some investment vehicles that were done through tax havens, and in the Paradise Papers we reported about that. Soros is also a funder of my organization, and he also funds a lot of other investigative reporting, independent investigative reporting media around the world.
What was what was the thing you found most surprising during either the Panama Papers or Paradise Papers? Maybe you were involved in the Paradise Papers, especially.
The most
surprising thing?
Discovery of.
I think you can take that question anywhere you want.
The most surprising at the very end of our investigation has been to discover that the most rich people of France was in the data set, and he was very well.
The richest person in France was in the set.
And it is the CEO of Louis Vuitton, which
Louis
is
Vuitton,
a luxury brand, the best luxury brand in France, and he was very well hidden between a lot of layers of financial account, and we figured out that he had 7 different offshore accounts around France, and that was a big story for us, and that was totally very interesting because it was for a lawyer point of view, it was not illegal, but it was totally immoral to do that, and plus it was very shameful for him because he's well known as a very powerful people, and knowing that he's putting some money around a lot of different accounts not in France, and even if he said that the fiscal administration in France were very known that organization, it was very a shame for him to be in front of our newspaper. So it was the most exciting news for us, and we were very proud of that because we just discovered that at the very end of the operation.
At the very end?
Yeah, and maybe 3 weeks before.
3 weeks.
And that's totally the hard work of our data team, and because they are very harsh in their investigation, and they are tough people who didn't want to, never want to just to handle the operation, that we finally discovered him.
Wow.
And it was the most huge impact for us.
That would be huge. We have a question here. Tell us more about the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists.
Oh, okay. So the ICIJ, those are the initials, was created about 20 years ago by a guy, a great journalist called Chuck Lewis, who used to work at 60 Minutes, was a producer, and he got tired of not being able to tell the stories he really wanted to tell, even working in 60 Minutes. So he went on to create something called the Center for Public Integrity, which is a US-based, Washington-based investigative reporting outlet focusing mostly on US issues, money in politics. And then Chuck, through his travels around the world, had been meeting with all the lone wolves. And he had realized that the lone wolves were all telling him that they were investigating the same thing. They were investigating the same companies, the Siemens bribery scheme and this other, but they had no idea. They were not connected. This was pre-internet. So Chuck, who was a visionary, thought about this network, was like, what if we bring them all together and have them talk to one another? So he actually brought them together physically, you may correct me, here to Stanford, and there was another a meeting elsewhere, I forgot where, Harvard, I don't know. But they met in person in 1997, 98, and they started sharing for the first time, almost pre-internet, documents, ideas, collaborated on stories about tobacco smuggling, about how Philip Morris and BAT had colluded with criminals all over the world to smuggle cigarettes, and went on to continue doing collaborations for several years until all these financial leaks came our way and forced us to kind of take that model to a more global level and to leverage technology. Because for a long time we were basically collaborating through email and face-to-face, and that's no way to collaborate when you want to do it at this level. So then we brought technology, and technology helped us deal with these terabytes of data.
Great. Just have room for a couple
We're
more questions.
non-profit, should I say that?
Definitely
non-profit
non-profit.
and accepting donations from the public. We also love when people volunteer their talents. We're very open. We get a lot, and I have to say, in these financial leaks, there are a lot of silent heroes, former accountants and former lawyers, or who basically called us and said, I will help you read documents. I don't need credit. I don't need money.
Wow.
I don't need to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I'm just going to help you understand this to get the story out. So if you have expertise and want to work with us, please don't hesitate to contact us.
Okay. We'll send out her email after we're done. How many successful prosecutions with prison terms so far? How much money recovered? How many current prosecutions? So what are some of the...
The latest numbers I have is the money recuperated so far, and this is an incredibly conservative estimate, is about $1 billion. That is money in taxes that a handful of governments around the world have announced publicly that they have recuperated. Think that we worked in 80 countries. The majority of those countries doesn't make that information available, like including the United States. We know that they are working on the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers and contacting the people named there, but they haven't disclosed. So a lot of money. There are about 170 open official inquiries in 79 countries around the world. So those are ongoing parliamentary investigations, prosecutions of different kinds. One of the most profound impacts was the recent announcement by England that it would force its British territories and dependencies, the majority of which are tax havens, to start disclosing what is called beneficial ownership information, which is basically who owns a company, which is the secret information.
Right.
So if that happens, if they follow through, that would be a game changer, a real game changer for democracy, for transparency, for journalism.
Right. And the Prime Minister of Iceland, of course, resigned.
Yeah, and we have the resignations. We know that there are so many things. The tax authorities, 30 countries, are now, they have their own consortium model after ours, and they actually share information and they meet in person. So
Wow.
if that's great. They were not talking to one another and had no idea, and now they are.
Great. So last question we have time for today. Is there any new information coming out about the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers? Is there any other things what happens after the publication of and release of those stories?
This is very much, and I don't know if you would agree, but it's very much an active leak,
Okay.
An active story. All the time we're giving access to US publications, to foreign publications. Every time there's a scandal, there's a new person in a cabinet, there's a new nominee of something, these organizations are requesting access. The database contains more than 30 million documents right now,
Wow.
secret documents, confidential documents, and we are working with more than 500 journalists all over the world. And they are, I would say every other week, there's a new story somewhere in the world that draws from this information. And we hope that whistleblowers keep coming. We need to protect those whistleblowers, and I would like to end, thanking the whistleblower, John Doe, and the whistleblower of the Paradise Papers for their courage to come forward. For the fear that they experienced, for the trust that they had when we were telling them, don't worry, it's going to take us a year and it's hundreds of us and it has never been done before, but we'll get it done.
But trust us.
Trust us. I want to honor the people who come forward at great personal risk,
Great.
and I hope that our countries can protect them better in the future.
Great, thank you.
And I will add that it is totally a continuing story because we ask many questions to the Panama Papers basis right now, because at every time we have a new case of investigation, a national one, an international one, we just ask. We just put new names in our basis, and right now we have a huge basis sharing with the help of ICAJ, and plus in Europe, the ICAJ experience gives a very great insight to many newsrooms, and we are involved in a lot of little collaboration and cooperation, and the main last well-known was about the Daphne project. I didn't know if you had heard about that. It was blogger woman who have been killed in Malta. Yes. His first name was Daphne. And a French reporter with a German one, which we were Süddeutsche Zeitung reporter, settled a corporation, and we were involved in this corporation. And with I think there were 30 reporters. We came to Malta again and reopened the case.
Wow.
Of the journalist work on, and we have a lot of. My team is very involved in many operations because we are just well known now.
Yes, you're well known now.
We used to collaborate, and people know that. So that's I think it's Panama Papers was totally a milestone in the way of journalism could thrive in the future. And we couldn't have any more. We have always still our wolf loans, no problem, but we have to go on this cooperation between newsrooms.
Great, it's changed the way journalism.
One last thing just to finish is that, so another big message from these collaborations is, and that's the Daphne project, and by the way, 3 European reporters have been killed in the past year in Europe. They can kill the story, they can kill the reporter, they can silence the reporter, but these networks of collaborations guarantee that they cannot take away, they cannot silence the story, because the colleagues are going to continue the story for anybody who is shut down, who is silenced.
Right, that's very important. Well, I want to thank Marina Walker and Cecile for your today.
Okay, good evening and welcome back from your break. As Don said, I'm Michael Bolden, one of the managing directors of the JSK Journalism Fellowships. We're discussing how to hold the powerful accountable. Don, Marina, and Cecile took us deep into some of the sweeping investigations that journalists do, but now we're going to talk about some of the work that journalists do day in and day out in Washington and elsewhere to help hold your government officials accountable. I'll give you some short background on our speakers, but check Canvas, the online class platform, for more information on our guests. Tonight, to my right, we have Sally Busby. She's the executive editor of the Associated Press. It is the not-for-profit news gathering cooperative that is more than 170 years old. Sally worked at various locations for the AP for 30 years, including as Washington bureau chief, where she oversaw coverage of the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections. Now she is in charge of all of that, plus AP's coverage of the rest of the world. To my left is Daniel Dale. Daniel is Washington bureau chief for the Toronto Star, Canada's largest daily newspaper. You may remember Toronto's crack cocaine smoking mayor Rob Ford from several years ago. Daniel was the reporter in the thick of covering Ford and the fallout. Now he reports from Washington, where he covers Trump and US politics. He is also the journalist behind Daniel Dale's Trump Checks, which tracks false claims made by the president. So. Okay, let's go to Washington. One of the things that Sally said actually right before we got on the stage was Daniel and Sally were talking about how they've actually had a little respite this week because the news hasn't been moving at hyper speed. But we exist in an age where it seems the news is always running flat out. Stories that in the past might have received more play and existed longer in the public consciousness, they're there and gone because the next thing's coming down the pike. So Sally, with so much coming at you, how does the AP determine what gets covered and how you're going to deploy limited reporters and editors most effectively?
Yeah, I mean, that's become a real challenge. Obviously, the amount of news that the president and the White House throw off on any given day is quite extraordinary at this moment. And it's not irrelevant, it's not frivolous. I mean, it shakes the world. People in Asia pay attention to what is happening. If you're doing things like making trade decisions that are genuinely globally significant. So obviously we pay a lot of attention to that. On the other hand, I think it's very important that we sort of keep that perspective about what is truly important and what is not as important. And one of the things that we have, or I'm not saying it's not important, it's just not as important, right? And we have tried to keep that perspective and really focus on the serious things that are happening and maybe not quite as much some of the things that are more stylistic and are surprising, but perhaps not quite as significant. It's hard. I mean, we haven't changed anything about our basic standards or the basic way that we approach news. But there have been little things like we didn't used to have a president who would make news at 5:30 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, right? And so you have to change your shifts. You have to have journalists come in earlier. He walks out of the White House and he sometimes addresses the cameras at 8 o'clock in the morning. So you've got to get your cameras there at 8 o'clock in the morning. That was sort of new, right? We have tried to also make sure, I mean, one of the things, as Michael says, with this incredibly fast-moving news cycle, there can be very significant things that happen, and people sort of forget about them the next day. And I think one of the things that is really important is that we are not doing that, that we continue to report on significant things that are happening that aren't necessarily the hottest thing that day. So one way that we've been trying to do that is, I mean, we have a lot of people at the White House, but we try to make sure that we have reporters who are also at the agencies and are actually figuring out what is the EPA doing day to day, what is happening with consumer affairs regulation in this country and things like that. And I get asked a lot, do those stories break through? I mean, if you're trying to do the journalistically correct thing, is anybody actually reading them? And it's a good question because Trump eats up a lot of the oxygen. And you can write a really serious story or do a really serious piece about environmental regulation in this country and it can get overlooked because he says something, really, really hot that day. Yeah. So it's a challenge, it's an ongoing challenge, I would say.
So Sally runs the AP. Daniel, you were the Washington bureau chief for the Toronto Star, and you're it. So first of all, why is a journalist from Canada devoting so much energy to covering the Trump administration? And how do you do it as a one-man band?
So one person is too few people to cover Trump himself, let alone the Trump administration. Canadians, I think, are watching this administration as if they are Americans. And I think that's always pretty much how Canadians observe American politics. We don't see ourselves as naive or ignorant or confused foreigners. People, I went back home, I just visited my family in Toronto about a year ago, and I went to a coffee shop in my neighborhood in downtown Toronto, and Sarah Sanders' briefing was playing on the local 24-hour cable station, with like the local weather bar and so on. So people know all the players, they know what's going on, and people are watching this with intense, a local, as if they are American interest. How I do this as a one-person bureau, it's difficult. The biggest challenge is determining, as we all do, as the AP does, but what is worth my time? Mm-hmm. And sometimes that doesn't mean writing the most important story of the day, but trying to find a unique, sometimes even quirky angle or an overlooked story that the AP or the New York Times or Washington Post are not covering. I went to business school in college, and I think of it in terms of adding value. And so I'm being paid to be in Washington. Is it valuable for me to write the same story that 100 outlets are writing about Nikki Haley leaving? Probably not, because we subscribe to the AP. We can run the AP story. So in a case like that today, it would be, can I do some smart analysis about what this means? Today, I don't think I had anything smart to say. In that case, I'd do something else, whether it's a funny story, a serious story, or whatever. But you can't really make plans even when you try to. So one of the ways I've tried to plan to make my life a bit easier when crazy things happen is to write basically advance obituaries for Trump administration figures resigning or getting fired.
Wow.
And so not obituaries, of course, as in them dying, but so I've gotten to use a bunch of these. Steve Bannon, Sean Spicer, Reince Priebus, and I had one for H.R. McMaster. But because I'm a one-man bureau and because I'm staying up till like very late, I always did, but I'm working often till, from the first tweets, at 7 in the morning, sometimes till 2 in the morning. And so consequently, and especially because my bureau is my home, I have a bed there. I take a lot of little naps to try to cover the Trump administration. So I told my editors when there were rumors that H.R. McMaster was about to be ousted or resign, I have a pre-written story on this, so if it happens, I'll just tell you, go, and we'll post it. And then I took a nap at about noon or something, and then McMaster was ousted while I was sleeping. So my editors are like, in this like 20-minute, half an hour period, my editors are like, hello, we thought you had a story. I'm like, I'm sorry, I just, So there's no rest. There's no time to.
Wow.
There's no time to relax. So that's what the administration is like.
Wow, I'm tired just listening to that. But Sally, so even with a bureau of dozens of people in Washington, how do you decide what tweet you're actually going to cover? I mean, with fear of missing out on what's going to be a hot story.
Yeah, I mean, we've had to make, I think not just because of resources, which is one issue, but I think also because of a certain level of responsibility. It was challenging at first. If he would tweet, there was a tweet once that was, I don't remember the exact wording, but it was something along the lines of, I'm going to outlaw flag burning in America. Okay, well, the president has a lot of power. The Supreme Court has ruled that burning flags is constitutionally allowed, and so he's not going to be able really easily to change that, okay? And so sometimes you have to take a deep breath and say, this is extraordinary, but what we really need to do is say that this isn't, really likely to happen, for example, or something like that, okay? The only thing that I would say about that, and we try to avoid, look, the thing about the AP is that we have a wide set of customers, and we want to create not boring news or neutral news, but we want to create objective, fact-based news. That's what we do, right? And so one of the things that we have tried to avoid a little bit is not to be snarky about the president, not to be he does a lot of extraordinary things. We let the facts speak for themselves. And that's what we've tried to do. And so we're not in the business of trying to, our journalists are not trying to provoke him when they're asking questions. They're trying to elicit news from him. They're trying to get him to talk about his policies. And that has served us pretty well. We think that that's the best way for us to serve, what is our mission, which is to provide good factual information so that people, you guys, can make decisions about what you want to do. It's not our job to tell you what decisions you should make. It's our job to give you factual information so that you can make good decisions. And so there have been times where we have said, he's kind of doing this, but that's not really that important. Let's keep that, let's report on it, but let's keep it limited and not kind of blow it into a federal case if it's not going to be a federal case. The only caution I would add on that, though, is that the president is an incredibly important person in the world. When he says things, it does roil the globe. And so you have to keep, even if he says he's going to do something and he can't do it, the words can still have impact. They can have impact on allies, they can have impact on markets, they can have impact on a whole lot of things. And so you can't ever really ignore it, right? And so it's been challenging. But there have been times when we've said, we're staying away from that because we don't, it's not that we're not reporting it, we're just going to report it at the appropriate level, not at the really, amped up level.
Yeah. So, as you say, words matter. And
Words do matter.
One of the things that Daniel has made a hallmark of his time in Washington is sort of tracking the false claims made by the president. And Daniel will even use the word lie. So Daniel, tell us about Trump checks, how you started that, what the current count is, as close as you can, how you managed to keep up, and how accurate your Trump checks are.
Sure. So it started in September 2016. So this was late in the 2016 election. And there was a day in mid-September where I was just so struck by how extraordinarily dishonest one candidate in this race was. And we all know that politicians of all stripes, including his opponent Hillary Clinton, have been dishonest in various ways. But this was just an extraordinary, the sheer quantity of the dishonesty I thought was a story in itself. And my frustration at that time was that I thought reporters were doing a decent job at pointing out the dishonesty on their own Twitter accounts. So if you were an avid Twitter user and you were on Twitter all day, you would know that Trump said 5, 10, 15, maybe 20 false things that day. But if you were to read the story in the next day's paper or online late that day or watch the network newscast or your local newscast, none of that I thought was coming through because, for example, Trump would do a rally speech or a quote-unquote policy speech where he'd make literally 20 false claims, but the ostensible purpose of the speech was to announce, say, a healthcare policy or an economic policy. The way that story was being covered in the next day's paper was Trump announces healthcare policy. And consumers of that story would not be told how dishonest this person was. And so I thought, this dishonesty was being treated as a kind of sideshow to the campaign. And I thought, this is the show in some ways, this kind of attack on truth, this complete and utter unprecedented disregard for accuracy should be treated as a central story of the campaign rather than something left to the fact checker to talk about in his Saturday column or whatever. And so I decided to try to make a list because I think lists can often serve as a way of accessibly organizing information in a way that trying to cram these fact checks into a conventional article may not. So I thought I would do this for a couple months, and then, I thought I'd be free of this responsibility. And so I was at Hillary Clinton's quote-unquote victory party on election night, and one of my first thoughts when all these states were falling for Trump was like, oh my God, I have to keep fact-checking this guy. So I took a break for the transition, and then I started his first lie. I think it was in. I forget I think it was in the inauguration speech or maybe just after, and he's like, maybe it was at a ball after, he's like, they said it was gonna rain, but it never, God protected me, and it never rained on my speech, and it was raining, as he spoke. So it was literally like the first moment, and then of course, he famously sort of setting the dishonesty tone with the crowd-sized lies, and so the total now, I'm still frantically trying to update from last week because he had 5 campaign rallies, and the more he talks, the more he lies. So it's above 2,900 now. The average at the end of 2017 was 2.9 false claims per day. It's now up to 4.5 per day. And so the pace in 2018 has really accelerated. I could talk about this forever, but basically the most frequent question I was being asked was, is he just talking more, or is the density of his dishonesty, is he lying more per word or just saying more words? And so with the help of a website called FactBase, which does transcripts of all of his comments, we found a way to quantify this. This is like a week-long project. And basically, my conclusion was that he is talking more, but he's also becoming much more dishonest per word as the campaign proceeds. As his term proceeds.
So, and you actually use the word lying and lies, and this is actually an issue in the journalism community because there are some newspaper editors who are famous for saying that, well, you can't be inside someone's head.
Yeah.
So why did you choose to use that wording?
I just think it's if we want to earn trust, we know in media we have a trust problem, and the way to earn trust, I think, is to be honest with people. And for some of the things the president says, there is no honest word, in my view, other than lie. And an example I often cite is, he gave this controversial speech to the Boy Scout Jamboree, you may remember, and he got some criticism for it, and then he said, no, the head of the Boy Scouts called me and said this was the best speech that had ever been given to the Boy Scouts. And then so I contacted the Boy Scouts, and they're like, no one called the president, no one told him that. And so you can go down this rabbit hole of like, well, maybe he's like, he convinces himself that I think we can safely say that some of these things are lies. I'll add though that I fight with people from the other perspective as well, because I don't call every false claim he makes a lie. I think in many cases it appears that he is either ignorant on policy matters, he is confused for whatever reason. I'm not saying this judgmentally, but I don't think the intent is there to deceive in all cases. And so I often say false claims. I get people yelling at me on Twitter saying, call it a lie, stop normalizing him. I don't think we can use it in all cases, but my argument is that it's the only honest word in some cases. So, with that, I turn to the executive editor of the AP. Sally, what is your position on using the word lie?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask me this question. So, we don't have a policy that says that we don't say we don't have a prohibition against the word lie. We subscribe a little bit more to, first of all, I completely, deeply respect Daniel's position and think he's doing terrific work. We do subscribe quite strongly to the idea that it is difficult to figure out intent. I don't think that it is difficult sometimes. The president is a showman. He has a serious problem with speaking accurately. Sometimes he clearly speaks inaccurately on purpose, okay? Sometimes he does it inadvertently. But to me, there's sort of a slightly deeper issue, and it probably just goes to what we're trying to do as a news organization, okay? So there's some academic research that shows that when certain people see the words fact check, they think that it comes from liberal news organizations, right? In other words, it's so ingrained in their head that the world is divided into two camps that when they see certain words, they're not even looking at the facts. They're actually just saying, it's a fact check, so it's from the liberal media, and I'm not going to pay attention to it. So I am a believer in not giving up on any person. I think that the fact is that the most strident ideologue in our society believes in some facts. They believe, somebody says, I'm going to sell you this car for $4,500, and they accept that as factual information, and they make a deal based on that, okay? And so my philosophy, my organization's philosophy, is that we are not giving up on any human on this planet. We think that if we provide factual information, some of it is going to get through to people. And that is our mission. Our mission is to provide factual information about what's happening in the world and let people make their own decisions. And it's just different. That's what our mission is. And so we don't have an editorial page. We don't do that. And I think, to me, the biggest thing, and this is not a criticism of anybody else's news organization, but I would rather work for a news organization that people on all spectrums of the political view, the entire political spectrum, look at, rather than talk to an audience that is sort of already convinced and I'm just giving them validation, okay? And I'm not saying that news organizations are doing that, but to me, I've always thought about that, that person out there who's busy in their real life and almost never looks at the news, and then something happens and something is said, and they go look for a non-biased news source because they might be curious, or even they don't do it intentionally, just comes into their world while they're listening to the radio or something. And it it pierces their brain, and they're like, oh, that, there is scientific evidence that global warming happens or something like that. And that to me is their nirvana. The nirvana is getting factual information to people who don't really go seeking for it, okay? And that it's in no way, the world should have a whole group of diverse news organizations, but to me, that has always been the best and noblest goal that we could reach. And that's why I think if we routinely, that's why we don't try to write snarky stuff about the president. That's why we don't try to provoke him at news conferences, because I went to, so a lot of my family is not of the political persuasion that most of the people in this room are, okay? And I went to a party that my brother threw a couple weeks ago, and a woman who is the wife of a retired military officer in suburban Virginia said to me, sometimes when I'm really confused about what's going on and things seem to hype up, I try to look at the AP app and just try to get the bare facts. And there's nothing that could possibly make me happier than that statement, okay? So. But that's just, I deeply respect what a lot of, you're doing a fabulous thing.
Well, well, and you have 170 years of history behind you as well.
Yeah, that's the other thing is that I just think that we want to keep to our standards because that's the long game. And that's what we tell ourselves. There were some people, the day after Trump won, a lot of people in Washington were shocked. And my news organization was shocked. And that's probably a reflection on us that we weren't out in the community enough and didn't know that that was going to happen. And there were some stories that went around Washington about reporters coming in and saying, I'm not going to cover him. I'm going to protest. I'm not going to cover him. Our deputy bureau chief at the time, whose name is Terry Hunt, a famous longtime White House correspondent, came in and he said, it's not our job to decide who's the president of the United States. It's our job to cover the president of the United States, regardless of who that person is. And for a journalist to say, on principle, I'm not going to cover this guy, you do the good, you do the bad, you're in there for the long game. Your job is to say what's happening in the government and inform people what's happening in the government. And that's what we've tried to keep our focus on.
Yeah. Thank you. So one last question on lies, because I find it so interesting. Daniel, I've read that you said you've talked to people who believe that not only is it okay that the president lies, they like that he lies. Why would anyone like that? What did they tell you?
Yeah, this was really educational for me. So I did, this kind of story has, I think, sort of become a cliche and it's been mocked, but I went out to so-called Trump country in Ohio. And I didn't want to ask people there the standard question that gets stories mocked, which is like, do you still like Trump, even though he did this new thing? People say, yes, I still like Trump. But I want to ask them how they are perceiving his honesty and dishonesty. As someone who spends so much of, I spend so much of my time fact-checking him, you wonder, not only is my work getting through, but is anything like my work getting through? Do these people know that he is lying? If so, do they care? Does it affect their perception of him? And so this was an unscientific sample. It was informal. It was two pro-Trump counties in basically rural Ohio. And one of the most common answers I got was, look, we know that he makes things up, but we like it because it messes with the elites. It gets them running around all crazy, like chickens with their heads cut off. These are the people who don't care about me or have made my life miserable, and he's got them all screwed up, and they don't know what to do. And so this, I expected some people to insist that he was honest. I thought some people would say, look, I know he's not always honest, but all politicians are liars. I didn't expect this sentiment that essentially encouraged him to lie because it bothers the people that they don't like. But I think that says something about the current state of our politics. And I think you see reflections of that sentiment in all kinds of debates, from the Kavanaugh debate we just had to any number of others, where people's positions are not so much about the merits, but about what their side can do to the other side, making the other side feel bad or feel confused or feel as insecure as these people themselves feel. So again, I'd emphasize this was an unscientific sample. I don't know how representative it is, but it felt enlightening to me.
Thank you. So let's talk about something else the president says. He loves to use the phrase fake news. And Sally, you've said that we're starting to see dangerous ripples and echoes of the use of the phrase fake news around the globe. What are you seeing, and why are you concerned about it?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the things that is very worrisome, not just to journalists, although it's very worrisome to journalists, but I think to kind of civil society in general, which is that the U.S., has, whether you agree that it's a good thing to do or didn't think it was a good thing to do, the U.S. for many decades had provided sort of a sort of moral leadership position in the world. Some people viewed that as self-righteous, some people viewed it as a good thing. But it factually is what happened. And I think that there has been a situation where people, some authoritarian leaders around the world think that it's a little bit more sort of open season because they don't think that the United States is going to stand up quite as much as in the past. So I think you see this in situations, in Myanmar, which is one of the countries that is the most repressive against media in the entire world right now. They're jailing journalists. They're not giving visas. She used the words fake news about the Rohingya crisis, and that just leapt out at me. Like, this is a country that has a terrible problem, and she basically said that the eyewitness reports of atrocities were fake news. And that, I don't know about you, but I find that terrifying. I found that completely terrifying, okay? When we did, and Marina in the previous panel talked a lot about Europe, There's some things happening in Europe. I know we all know that. And so we did a story about some corruption in, I think it was Latvia, I don't remember exactly. And it was about local officials and ties with some corrupt Russian government officials. And we had a photo from about 10 years ago that showed these people kind of yucking it up at a hunting lodge or something like that. And the government essentially said that we had faked the photo, okay? And so that stuff is starting to creep into the rhetoric of authoritarian leaders around the world. And I think that's a really, really dangerous situation. I think the situation that is happening this week in Turkey with the Saudi, he's kind of a dissident and he's kind of a journalist, is really scary, because I think that I don't know if the government of Turkey is strong enough to push back against the Saudis all the way on that thing. There was some reporting today that said that the leader of Turkey is secretly hoping that the United States will be the tough guy on this one. And that kind of thing is different than it used to be. That is, I think, very, very worrisome, both for journalist safety, but also for the much larger universe we live in.
Right, so everyone's probably familiar, but if you're not, so Jamal Khashoggi, who's a Washington Post contributor, went into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul to get documents for his wedding, and he never came out. And some of the reporting suggests that he was killed inside the embassy. As absolutely horrific. And one of the things, I guess, Sally, that you have to be thinking about as the leader of this global news gathering organization, what does that mean for your people?
Yeah, we have worries about what the campaign trail in the United States is going to look like. there has been some very, nasty rhetoric and viciousness and sort of threats of violence directed at journalists, sometimes at Trump's rallies, sometimes on the campaign trail. We are worried about that in this next cycle a lot. We have a lot of worries overseas. We think that there is a little bit of a, I don't know, with the free reign on journalists a little bit around the world, and that is very scary for us. The interesting thing that we're seeing, which is really nervous, I mean, journalists have been dying in conflicts, and that's a terrible thing, but that's, we try to prevent it as much as possible, but if you're covering a war, the chances that something bad happens to you are high, and that's the reality of the situation. What is scary right now, and I think this was actually CPJ that called this out today, is that it's more like targeted attacks on journalists. It's not people being accidentally, they're covering a war and they get blown up by a mortar. It's that they're actually being targeted for assassination and things like that. That's happened tragically for many years in Latin America, in many places. It seems to be creeping into other parts of the world, and I think that's very scary. Myanmar is, these two Reuters journalists have been essentially thrown in jail for 8 years. The thing that is scary is how incredibly effective that is, okay? Those guys got put in jail, and there's not as much independent reporting coming out of Myanmar. We're trying like mad, I'm here to tell you. But you don't want your people to be thrown in jail either, and so sometimes you have to pull them out of there because they're gonna get jailed if you don't pull them out of there. And so Myanmar did an incredibly effective job of silencing independent reporting in that country by jailing those two people. And you're not gonna know what's gonna happen with the world's biggest refugee crisis if you don't get some independent journalists there telling you what's gonna happen, because that government is not apparently going to accurately report what's going on. So we are very worried. I think it's a very rough time.
So we have a rough time in the rest of the world. We know what's happening here in the US. Daniel, I'm very curious. So in Canada, what's the attitude toward the media? I mean, are they respected? Do you see the same thing happening with how people engage the media with the enemies of the people thing? What's going on?
I've been in the U.S. for 3 years now. 3 years now. I'm based in Washington, so I don't feel like I'm the authority on the current sentiment because it changes fast. I think my sense of it is that, as with many things, we have the same issues as the U.S. does, but in a little bit of a milder form. And so I think we have the same issues with an erosion of trust in media, with shortage of resources leading to an erosion of local and provincial level coverage, the Canadian equivalent of the loss of state house coverage here in the US. I think so there are important democratic effects of that, but we don't, as of now, although I think the right in Canada, the Conservative Party, has long been more critical of the media than the Liberals and the Social Democratic, New Democratic Party has. You don't see this kind of Trumpian all-out rhetorical assault, and hopefully we won't. But I don't know.
Okay, so I'll ask you both an easy question before we go to the audience questions. What's going to happen in the midterms?
What's going to happen in the midterms? Whoa.
Answer that any way you want.
Well, I mean, I think that the real effect of the recent fight over the Supreme Court nominee was basically to sort of, heat up both sides, but not necessarily change that much about the overall balance, because the Republicans got very energized by this debate, and I think that the Democrats also did. I think the most important thing that's happening, so Trump's base is extremely supportive of him. There's been no erosion as far as we can tell. There does seem to be some erosion in support of what we commonly call, I don't know, independent suburban women in certain locations, okay? And that's probably going to benefit the Democrats in the House races, because the Democrats are probably going to, I don't know if there's going to be a blue wave, no idea, but it does seem like the Democrats have a pretty solid, at least potential chance to win control of the House, because there's some erosion of Trump support among independent women in particular, I would say. I think that happened before Kavanaugh. It certainly is likely to be intensified by Kavanaugh. The Senate, though, is, the the Democrats always had a tough uphill climb on the Senate, and I don't personally see any change in that. I can't predict what's going to happen, but it certainly does not look, a betting person would not think that the Democrats are, have a tough road to regain the Senate, I would say, and it doesn't seem that there's any change in that. So I'm just telling you what we've been writing in Analysis on the Wire. I'm not making any, this is what our reporters think is happening.
So Daniel, just a slightly easier question for you. So what are you preparing to cover? Because you're a one-man band, you try to find the unique things, the things that will rise above some of the other coverage. What are you watching in the next few weeks?
So it's a very limited amount of time for a one-person bureau to cover the midterms. I've been occupied by NAFTA, or not NAFTA, we can't call it that anymore, by the USMCA. So those negotiations had been my focus for a number of months. Now they're wrapped up, so I have less than a month to basically cover the midterms. So I'm interested in a couple of things. One is as Sally was talking about, the efforts in suburban, more educated, more upscale districts, like we see in California, by Democrats to flip long-held Republican districts that were won by Hillary Clinton in 2016. And so after I finish at Stanford today and tomorrow, I'm going to go to the LA area and go to some districts like Congressman Knight's district, for example. That race against Katie Hill is very interesting. What's intriguing to me is that the House races are existing almost in a separate universe in some ways from the Senate races. So you have this universe of House races in which those kinds of female voters are very important. And then we have these contested Senate races that are, overwhelmingly in very conservative, very pro-Trump states that react very differently to things like the Kavanaugh battle. And so I'm interested in the interplay between those two. Will we have totally separate outcomes?
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah, a lot of questions.
Great, thank you. So now we will have a lightning round and try to get in some of the audience questions. So, okay, what would happen if the media did not cover Trump on a minute-by-minute basis?
Great question. Would he tone it down? Would he play less the media? These are the kinds of things we debate. I think that there is some evidence that he does respond to attention. So one of the reasons that we try to do, what I talked about, which is to not make a federal case out of something that isn't that important, is kind of to try to keep that sober sort of attitude toward that. I don't think that that's ever going to happen. It's hard for me to do that because I completely have sympathy with the question. On the other hand, it's not just Americans who are in this vortex. I spent a week in Japan and Asia in February, and I thought, this is great. I'm going to get to ask all these questions to a person. Every newspaper editor and every, media person that I talked to in Japan, just grilled me about Donald Trump for 2 hours solid over dinner. And so, they are, and it's not an irrelevant thing for them because he has the ability to impact their world, okay? And so it's not just that Americans are obsessed with this. This is an incredibly important person in an incredibly important position. And ignoring him is not really it's not an option, basically.
So next question, can you please explain the ethical principles or guidelines that journalists and media organizations use when we receive information from a source who may have violated laws to obtain or release the information? Daniel, any?
Can I defer to you because she's the head
Okay.
of an organization?
Yeah, sure.
And this question is about hacking or just about sources?
It's about sources who might have obtained information in questionable ways.
Question.
Yeah.
This is one of the things that journalists, our standards say that we should always pay attention to the source of the information and the motivations of the person who gives you information, especially if it's secret, especially if it's illegally obtained. Generally in the United States, reporters cannot ask someone to go break the law for them, but if they get information that is illegally obtained, they have a First Amendment right to publish it if there are reasons to publish it, okay? So we were always used to putting ourselves through these ethical questions. If an anonymous source, if someone clearly has a grudge, the information could be tainted. Then again, maybe the information isn't tainted. Maybe the information is inherent in documents, and the person has a grudge, but the documented material is still important and still of public interest. So those are the kinds of questions that you go through. Does the person have a grudge? Does the person have a vested interest? Is the information solid despite that? Has the person tainted the information in some ways? Do they have it in a real, factual way, okay? So we were used to doing that. Then all of a sudden, information started coming out through hacks, okay? And we struggled for a little while. There's no question. Everybody struggled during the 2016. Now, we didn't understand all the ramifications. We didn't know that it was deliberate plants and things like that. But, it's the same issue, but in a different context, where people are deliberately releasing hacked information to make other people look bad, okay? And so what we have learned, and journalists learn, they make mistakes, and as things change, they have to take their ethics and their standards, and they have to figure out, a new situation. Now I need to think about hacking, and I didn't ever think about that because it never used to exist, okay? And we learned over time that we could be manipulated by people who hack, just like we could be manipulated by sources. So I think we've gotten, we're learning and we're getting better at that, but there was a rocky period, I would say. And it's not just my organizations, it's everybody where we struggled with this issue.
Okay, thank you. So Daniel, you actually spent a lot of time looking at these. Who really writes Trump's tweets? Are they vetted by White House staff?
We still don't I haven't seen any authoritative reporting on this. We know some of them. If there is a hashtag or a photo montage or anything that involves things other than words, it's likely someone other than the president. Dan Scavino is his social media director. We know that he writes some of them. I have read, although I haven't confirmed with my own reporting, that he likes to workshop some of his tweets. So he'll propose these 140 or 280 character messages to people around him and hear them out and then tweet it. But I think many of them, and I think it is clear that many of them are indeed authentically Donald Trump.
Okay. Great.
Especially the ones at 5:30 in the morning.
Yeah, there are times, and there's there's the Fox hour. There's distinct periods of his tweeting.
Well, and for a while there was some analysis being made based on whether it looked like the tweet came from an Android phone or an iPhone, or I don't know what type of currency that actually had.
Yeah, I don't know.
So, okay. So a question that sort of goes to the ethics of journalism itself, I think, to help people understand what we do. Do you think it's fair that the media controls what's deemed newsworthy based on what sometimes are personal hunches, which in essence, that itself can constitute a toxic closed-source black box model?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So what I would say is that the way that our world is going, there is more opportunity for people to break through what you might think of as, the people who determine the news or something like that. Marina was the greatest example of that, right? There are organizations, other nonprofit news organizations, some of them very small in your communities or in other little communities, bloggers, other people who can bring issues forward that, maybe news organizations are ignoring, and put that forward as another sort of conversation. So I think that if you think there was a monopoly of news organizations decided this was important and this wasn't important, some of that is being broken. There's a fascinating story today about some of the information that's coming out about the guys, Britain has accused the Russians of killing the spy, poisoning the spy. And some of the really solid, what we think of as kind of journalistic information that has come out is a private sort of investigative group, a couple guys who had done a lot of good work around the Syrian war and things like that, and they have been trying to figure out who the Russians behind this were. So, is that a news organization? Is it an advocacy? I don't know what exactly it is, but it's a really interesting phenomenon that is a good source of objective information. And so there's a lot more sources of information in our world. The thing that I fear, and this is, I think, where the question is getting is, after the last election, everyone kind of was wringing their hands and saying the Washington bubble was too inside baseball and it became too self-reflexive and didn't actually know what was going on in the country. And we're going to reform that. So if you look at Washington News right now, it's become more inside baseball. It's focused totally on Trump. It hasn't gone out and talked to a person in Ohio in a real long time, okay? And I do fear that, you know, the vast majority of journalists in this country are centralized in Washington. It's a very important story. But I would love, I mean, it would be the best thing in the world if there were more journalists who were out in local communities and more journalists doing investigations on things that didn't have anything to do with Donald Trump. And, you know, I think that's the danger, is that the kind of the heavy focus on inside baseball politics in our country, which is incredibly important because our politics are crazy. We don't want that to be the only story that gets reported in this country, and that's what I worry about.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We are out of time. Let's thank Sally and Daniel for joining us this evening.
Thank you.